Welcome back to another episode of the Fearless Society podcast. I'm Nick, and this is Gabby. And this season, we've been talking all about spiritual disciplines. And today's episode is all about the spiritual discipline of simplicity. Let's jump in.
You're listening to the Fearless Society podcast, and we're building a community of fearless Christians who boldly live out the call that God has placed in our lives. We aren't afraid to talk about who we are and what we believe. Following Jesus today isn't easy, but it is worth it. And our goal is to come alongside you as we encourage and equip each other to live boldly and fearlessly, because a fearless church begins with us. Together, we are the Fearless Society.
All right, so Gabby, we are in like peak fall season. And so one of the kind of cliche and controversial topics of fall is pumpkin spice. And so do you like things that have been pumpkin spiceitized?
Well, I think I could probably write an entire paper on my feelings and thoughts on pumpkin spice. I
So your thoughts are not simple.
They are not simple at all. No, they are simple. It's overdone. Okay. Like, you can't walk through the grocery store without an entire aisle being devoted to pumpkin spice. Like, you've got pumpkin ice cream, pumpkin spice ice cream, pumpkin spice latte ice cream. You have pumpkin Cheerios, pumpkin cereal, pumpkin oatmeal, pumpkin, you name it. And it's probably pumpkinized. I mean, you could probably walk into like the meat department and find like pumpkin flavored pork chops or something. Like, I don't know. It's everywhere. So I think it's overdone. I've had this pumpkin spice latte a couple times because in the moment it sounds really good, but then I get it and I'm like, yeah, this is why I don't drink it very often. I don't really care for it. I much prefer simple coffee. Give me coffee with a little bit of cream or milk in it, and occasionally maple syrup. If you've never had maple syrup in your coffee, you need to try it.
Fair enough. Yeah, I love a good pumpkin pie, but that's about where the pumpkin spice should end in my mind. Just pumpkin pie, enjoy it, and
when it's done,
keep
it's
it
done.
special. Yeah.
All right. So what are we talking about today?
We are talking about simplicity, the spiritual discipline of simplicity. And so what is the spiritual discipline of simplicity?
Well, I think when I think of simplicity, the first thing that comes to my mind is minimalism, right? Like, that's kind of taken the world by storm. Maybe, pre-pandemic, I think a lot of people in the pandemic realized like, oh, I want more stuff. But it was like this big thing for a long time, minimalism and owning less stuff. And so I think in my mind, I automatically go from simplicity to minimalism really fast. But simplicity isn't just minimalism. It's not just owning less or having less. It's really a heart thing. It's really a posture of our heart that we have.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And not that minimalism is bad. I think that can be a good thing for certain people, and it's not for everybody, but it doesn't, just because it's not the spiritual discipline of simplicity doesn't make it a bad thing.
Right. And it can actually help you learn the spiritual discipline of simplicity. If you're somebody who owns a lot of stuff and you've got a lot of clutter and you've got a lot of stuff that you don't use, and you go, man, like, I want to learn how to live more simply. Minimalism is like a tool that can help you get there, but it's not synonymous,
Yeah. And so the spiritual discipline of simplicity, would you say that this is, I know you talked about it kind of being a posture of the heart, but where does this discipline kind of play out in our lives? Is it primarily a physical thing that plays out in our physical lives? Is it primarily an inner thing? Is it a spiritual thing? Is it a mental thing? Like, where would you say it plays itself out?
That's a really good question, because I think so easily we see the physical side of it. we see, simplicity often in our finances, in our possession, in our time. Simplicity can even tie into, conversations about modesty. And, I know Paul encourages women not, or was it Peter? Paul encourages women not to like adorn themselves with their outward appearance of gold and jewelry and all of these things to bolster their status. And so
Mm,
he's encouraging women to be simple, to live simply, not set yourself above other people, not view yourself as better or worse than other people, but to approach the way that we even dress with simplicity in mind. And so I think the physical sides of simplicity are just the outworking of what God's doing in your heart. The heart posture of simplicity is a recognition that God is the giver of every good thing and that God owns everything, and that everything that we have, whether it's our time, our energy, our money, that the very breath we breathe is God given to us. And so simplicity is, okay, how can I live my life in a way that allows me to glorify God through what he's given me, that allows me to be thankful for what he's given to me, and that allows me to have the most margin to use what he's given me for other people, to bless others, to encourage others, to pour into others.
mm. Yeah. And so it sounds like this is something that kind of begins in our hearts and in our minds, and then it works itself out in every area of our life, really.
Right. And now, like starting in your heart and starting in your mind, yes, but because there's a physical aspect of it, I think it can be jump started through physical means, like
Mm,
if you're if you're living outside your means, right? And you're spending more than you're bringing in, like there's going to be a like physically detrimental thing that happens. Like you're going to be in debt. You're going to have a lot of debt that needs to be paid off. And sometimes to learn the spiritual discipline of simplicity, we have to become disciplined in our finances to pay off that debt, to live within our means. Or if we have like, if we're spending all of our time taking care of the things that we own, folding all the laundry and cleaning all the knickknacks and like our entire world is taken up by the things that we own, that we don't get to be a part of a body or do anything outside of taking care of our possessions. Well, then the physical aspect of decreasing your possessions is a way that you can increase that heart posture and increase that heart and that mind that recognizes, wait a minute, like I don't need this many things. I can live simply. This can be my attitude about all of life. Does that make sense?
yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of this kids radio program that used to play on the Christian radio on Saturday mornings. And there was one episode, and I don't remember anything from the episode other than this goofy song. And there was one line from the song that said, "The more you have, the more you have to take care of the things that you have."
Yeah.
And it's so true in life. And like I know now that we've got vehicles and a house and just different things to take care of. And so that means, well, okay, now I either need to have money to pay somebody to take care of my cars, or I like to work on my own cars, but that means I need to have tools and a place to work on them and time to work on them. And it's just like everything we own takes a certain portion of our resources, whether it be time or money. And that doesn't mean that the right answer is to not own a vehicle, because for us that would really limit what we were able to do. And so the solution is not always cutting those things out, but I think just having that recognition of the true cost of owning different things and what it's going to cost in time and money, and being aware of that and trying to do our best to minimize waste in those different areas of our lives.
Yeah. As you were talking about that, I just thought of a conversation we had with someone earlier today about how it's so easy to sit here and to look back and go, oh man, like I wish I lived in like horse and buggy days. Oh, I wish I wish I was like one of the Amish. Their life just seems so simple. And we spend all of our days rushing around, doing all the things, being busy 24/7, taking care of our stuff, and that we have this longing for the simpler days. In reality, those days aren't simpler necessarily. They're just different. The people were back in like horse-drawn carriage days, like you had more of an attitude of like, the women didn't work, but that didn't mean their lives weren't simple. Like they're tending a garden, they're helping their community, they're raising their kids, they're cooking the meals, they're doing all of these things. And then to boot, you have like, all kinds of different world issues. You have different diseases, you have different health concerns, and it's kind of like a trade-off, but we definitely are craving in our world today this idea of having a simple life. And if you're looking at anybody else's life or any other time in history going, oh man, I wish I had their life. I wish I lived at this time in history because it was just so simple back then maybe that's a sign that you need to start practicing the spiritual discipline of simplicity and start simplifying your life. I know we talked about possessions, but again, time is another thing that when we fill our time, I mean, it's a sad reality that most homes, you have to have 2 working adults in a home to be able to make ends meet. With that, you get, you have a couple who's both working a full-time job, and then you have kids who are taking sports, who are involved in activities. Maybe you're involved in church and you have a Bible study, or you have different things that you do throughout the week. You're going. And the things that you're involved in aren't bad, but you're longing for the simplicity and rest that comes with the simplicity. And instead of realizing that you can have that today, you can have simplicity in your life today, you're pining for a different time period. But God knew that you would be born today. He put you in this life, in this time frame. And so pining for the past just because it seems more simple, it is disregarding the plan of God for your life. Like God put you here in this time for a reason. And the spiritual discipline of simplicity will help us in that process of being able to fulfill whatever God has called us to in the moment.
Mm. Yeah, that's good. And so how does simplicity help us to grow in our faith?
I think it's a good question. I think so often I can separate the two of them and I can say, oh, simplicity, I can simplify, I can be happier, I can be more relaxed, and then my faith over here. But simplicity actually increases our faith, because when we live simple, there's several things that it does. It encourages gratitude, which is another spiritual discipline we'll get to in a couple of weeks, I think. But when we're so busy, either doing all the things, having all the things, being all the things, what happens is we don't have an opportunity to enjoy God's blessings. And so through simplicity, we actually count our blessings. And then we get to practice a spiritual discipline of gratitude more, which should, if done correctly, lead us back into the throne room of God to praise Him and to give Him glory and honor for the blessings that He's given us. How many times have you gone through your day and gone, oh man, I'm too busy to pray. I'm too busy to read my Bible, or I'm only going to read a tiny bit because I have too much going on. I have too many things to take care of. When we practice the spiritual discipline of simplicity, now we're opening up our lives to having more time to spend in prayer, in Bible reading, in meditation, in all of these other spiritual disciplines that God calls us to. And in addition, like, simplicity, I think we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but simplicity creates margin in our life. And when God speaks to you and tells you to do something, do you have the margin to be able to listen and obey? Or are you going to spend days, weeks, months, whatever it is, stressing to try to find the margin to be able to fulfill the call that God has placed in your life? That's how spiritual discipline helps us grow in our faith.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the same as the last couple of weeks have been Bible reading and Bible study and Bible memorization. Those are clearly like, oh yeah, those are growing our faith. But then, we go, oh, simplicity. Well, it doesn't feel as like it's growing our faith as much as Bible reading. And yet simplicity is what allows us to do more of those things.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's possible to take simplicity too far?
Yes. It's interesting. I think you've heard the story too of this one family, and their goal was to live in such a way that they could give anything that they had, everything that they had, to help other people. The problem was they were in such a place that like their kids were going hungry and their kids didn't have clothes and their kids were starting to become bitter towards their giving because they were neglecting feeding and taking care of their family to live as simply as possible so that they could give more away. And it's really hard because on first thought, that sounds so righteous. Like, oh, you're doing less, you're having less so that other people can thrive. But I think especially as parents, there's gotta be some sort of balance there because we don't want our kids growing up being bitter because we loved other people more than we loved them. And so our simplicity as a family, like God has blessed us richly just simply in putting us in the, like, allowing us to be born in the country that we're in, like that's a huge blessing. We have a lot of freedom. We have a lot of prosperity in this country. And so we easily take that for granted. We should be giving. We should be seeking, looking at our finances, looking at our position and our time and going, how much can I give? How much more can I give? But not to the detriment of our families. If you're single, you can live on a lower income. You have a little bit more leeway, but when you've got kids, when you've got a family, God has entrusted them to you to take care of, to provide for. They are your first ministry, whether you're husband or wife, like both men and women are called to family. And so I would just be careful not to go too far in that sense,
Yeah. I just, when I think about that question of taking simplicity too far, when I was doing carpentry, I'm a tool person. I love tools. And my truck was always, packed full of all different sorts of tools. And of course I did a lot of renovation work. So there was, I was carpenter by trade and kind of specialized in finished carpentry, but it was not uncommon at all for me to be doing electrical work or plumbing work or framing or all sorts of stuff. And so I needed kind of this plethora of tools to be able to do all these different things. And there was another guy that I used to work with, and he mostly did framing, but he would show up on the job with his saw, his hammer, and his tape measure. And that was it. Like, if he couldn't do it with those three tools, like, it just didn't need to be done, in his mind. And man, he was one of the hardest workers I've ever seen. Like, you could not outwork this guy. He had an incredible work ethic. But there were certain things that he really needed more tools for to do a good job with, and he just didn't care to have them. And And so some of the things that he was doing kind of suffered because he was so simplistic. But one of the things that did for him is it made him very fast. Like he could work incredibly fast because he wasn't ever going to look for a tool that he had misplaced. He was never he had what he had and that was it. And then he just worked. And so there's upsides and downsides sometimes, especially when you get towards, when you start getting towards the edges of this, where you're either like, your life is totally hectic and crazy and not simple at all. You could make all sorts of excuses for good reasons why your life is like that, but really your life is probably suffering because of that. And if you're on the other end and you're just ridiculously simple and you're like, oh, I'm just trying to live a simple life. Well, your life may be being hindered by that oversimplicity. Yeah. And I think another thing too is, we're talking a lot about finances, but one of the other things I've done is worked in some like networking and IT stuff with churches. And oftentimes churches are on a tight budget, especially when it comes to that sort of stuff. And that stuff can be very expensive. And so I've spent a lot of my time in that was using kind of like home grade equipment to kind of manage a network that really should have been something more. And then there was a point where I was able to I was working, I don't even remember where this was, but we had enough money to kind of purchase some base level, kind of more enterprise grade equipment. And my gosh, was that worth the investment? Like it made my job of managing it so much easier and freed up so much time for me to be able to do other things that were more important. And so sometimes you need to sometimes it's okay to spend money on things that will simplify the time area of your life or simplify another area of your life.
So kind of along those lines, one of the things is you were telling those stories that I started thinking of is like, the Bible says that we are created and we have a purpose. Ephesians tells us, for you are God's workmanship created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for you to do. Like God has put us in this time that we're living in for a reason. And that reason is God's call, whatever that may be, whether it's working in a church, working in a secular field, whatever it is, God has called you and he's called you to do something specific. And so when it comes to possessions or finances or simplicity, we oversimplify when we no longer have the tools that we need to fulfill God's call. Like simplification, like the spiritual discipline of simplicity is to allow us to live with more margin and create more space and create more time and have a more simple life, so that we can do the things that God has called us to do. If you oversimplify and now, all you have is a saw, a hammer, and a tape measure, but you need a screwdriver or you need a pair of pliers, like now you don't have the tools to do what God has called you to do. So now you have to unsimplify, if that's a term, like then you have to add those tools back in, if God has called us to have this family, which he did, he gave us our children, and then we just go, oh, we're going to simplify. So we're going to live in a 1-bedroom house. Like that's not the tool that we need in order to fulfill the call of God on our lives. And so you can oversimplify when you no longer have the ability to fulfill the call of God on your life. Just like if your life is so full and you have no margin, you can't fulfill the call of God on your life. Again, simplicity starts with the heart. It starts with an understanding that God is the giver of every single thing, including your call. And so we honor Christ, we honor God with our possessions, with our time, with our finances, with our attitudes and our our thoughts and all of these things are a way that we honor God, and all of these things we can simplify to point us back to Christ. Now, I also believe that if you have nothing in this world and you have, a saw, a hammer, and a tape measure, 'cause I'm just using that story again, God is the giver of every good thing. God's going to give you what you need to fulfill his call, And so there is grace. If you've oversimplified and you're going, oh, shoot, what do I do now? And God's calling you to something and you're like, yeah, I just got rid of everything that I would need to do that. Like, God is the giver of every good thing. He's the giver of all of the blessings in our life. He is more than capable to provide for each and every one of us, no matter where we're at.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think just as we're sitting here talking, I'm kind of thinking of this really in terms of efficiency, right? And so my goal in simplifying is maybe more along the lines of becoming more efficient with my time and with my money, cutting out waste, right? And so if I'm spending money on something that's not building up my life, that money is kind of being wasted. Or if I'm spending time on something that's not building people up, that's not helping me to fulfill God's call on my life, then that time is wasted. And so I can really simplify my life by cutting out those things that are wasteful of my resources that God has blessed me with. And that doesn't mean that everything has to be directly useful, right? There are things that are indirectly useful.
Rest and enjoyment are useful.
Right. Entertainment can be a useful thing in your life to help you to refresh and revive so that you're ready to go into the next thing that God has for you. And I realize to a certain extent that's a luxury that we have here in America that a lot of people don't have. But just because not everyone has it doesn't mean that God hasn't blessed us with it and we shouldn't receive it with thanksgiving, and so I think for me, I think that it's helpful for me to think about simplicity kind of in terms of efficiency and cutting out wastefulness in my life.
Right.
Yeah. And like you said, this is to a certain extent about being more available for what God's calling us to. But you've also talked a lot about margin, right? And just having some empty space in your schedule, having some extra financial resources that are available if God calls you to give to something, having some emotional resources available to give to someone who might be in need of some emotional support, and having that margin in our lives. And while on the one hand, it's helpful to think about, oh yes, I'm building this into my life so that God can, so that I'm ready for God to call me into things. At the same time, if we're constantly looking to expend those things,
that's not simplicity.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we really need to be, it's not just about doing, it's about being obedient to God.
Right.
And so just because I'm simplifying my life and I'm doing it to serve people and to serve God, doesn't mean I need to immediately turn around and rush into figuring out how I'm going to use all that margin that I've created.
Right. And we're going to be talking about the spiritual discipline of rest, which I think goes right along with simplicity. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about that, like not rushing from one thing to the next, and that it's okay and good and God ordained that we should have seasons of rest, that we should be able to sit down and be refreshed. But we'll talk about that in another episode. So make sure you keep an eye out. I think it's next week, if I'm not mistaken, is that episode. So be sure to come back next week if you're interested in that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So kind of let's finish off with some practical how-tos. Like, what are some ways that we can begin building simplicity into our life?
Well, I think the first thing before you start building simplicity into your life is to start by taking inventory of your life. Because this is going to really clue you into where you need simplicity the most, because we can sit here and we can give you all of the same tips that you could go get from a financial planner or a minimalist organizer, but it all starts with taking inventory. And you can start just simply by like what takes the most of your time. Let's assume that you sleep 8 hours a day. That means you have 16 hours a day when you're awake. Now, like 50% of Americans sleep less than that. We're a little crazy and busy, but for, 8 hours is recommended. Assume you sleep 8 hours a day, 16 hours you're awake. Then if you work an 8-hour a week, 40-hour a week job, you're working 8 hours a day. And if you spend about an hour getting ready for work, now you have 7 hours left of your day. If you commute 30 minutes to work, now you're down to 6 hours. And if you factor in maybe like an hour and a half to cook and eat all of your meals, breakfast and dinner at home, prepping lunch, stuff like that. Well, now you're down to like 4.5 hours, give or take, in your day. What do you spend those 4.5 hours on? And within reason, you can't just look at one day, because one day, I might come home from work and I missed a load of laundry from the day before, or I'm trying to get caught up on something from the weekend. And so my 4.5 hours are laundry and cleaning and general housework that's just trying to keep up with 5 kids and a dog, and so one day, those 4.5 hours might be eaten up really fast. Another day, 2 of those hours might be sitting and having coffee with a friend, and so it's kind of like take inventory of your life. That's just an example of what one day, about 4.5 hours, Monday through Friday, each day that you have, plus the weekends. Where do you spend your time? Do you spend it all on taking care of your possessions? Do you spend it all on work? Do you have no downtime? Do you working multiple jobs just to try to make it? Really just start taking inventory of your life and seeing, where do you need margin? Do you need more time for rest? Do you need to get a better hold on your finances? Without understanding the inventory of your life, you're not going to know how to implement the spiritual discipline of simplicity. So that's the first thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think too, everybody knows that our smartphones can be such a distraction in our lives. And I'm really thankful that both iPhone and Android phones have built-in tools now to kind of help you manage that. You can set timers on your app so that you're limited in how much time you can spend on that app each day. You can go into your phone and you can see how much time you've spent on your phone and what apps you're spending time on. And it can be a real wake-up call when you go in there and look at that of how much time gets kind of wasted on those things. And again, that's not to say that those things are bad, because all of those things can be tools that can be used in the mission that God's called us on. But we should be aware of how we're spending our time. And so, yeah, an inventory is good. I think too, it's anything that you do every single day, even if it's only for a few minutes, will ultimately amount to a pretty significant portion of your life in the end. And so I think it's at this stage, it's really important to focus on those things that you do every single day, or even those things that you do most days.
Yeah.
Because again, they will add up to a significant portion of your life.
Yeah. I'm at over 1,000 hours washing dishes. I'm just kidding. It's probably way more than that. So you're going to take inventory, then you're going to look at your life and decide the biggest area that you need to simplify. What are in your life are you struggling with the most? Where are you the least grateful? Again, we said back in the beginning, like, the spiritual discipline of simplicity will allow us to slow down and thank God for the things that he has and recognize his blessings. Where are you not recognizing God's blessings? That may be a clue that you need to simplify. And then just start one step at a time. You're not going to go from like crazy busy to all this free time in a day. You're not going to go from maximalist to minimalist in an hour. like be realistic. Like spiritual disciplines are like habits that we form. It's like a muscle that needs to be worked out. And you don't just go to the gym and pick up a like a 50-pound dumbbell and like lift it without any issues. Like, no, like you work up to the higher weights. Like you can't bench press 350 if you can't bench press 50. A little bit will strengthen your muscles. And as you continue to keep working those spiritual disciplines, you'll go stronger and stronger in those areas. So maybe you need to get out of debt. Maybe you need to look into minimalist ideas as a tool to help you declutter your possessions, or maybe you need to simplify your routines. We were just talking with our kids the other night, and our 6-year-old was talking about, what if we do Taco Tuesday and Soup Saturday? And so he was practicing some alliteration and coming up with like different meals for different days of the week. It was really cute. But things like that honestly can help you simplify your routine. Maybe you're so busy that you can't even have one dinner together with your family or with a friend or a significant other. Like, how do you need to simplify your routine so that it's easier for you to go through your day? These are all areas that you can simplify, but take it one step at a time. You're not going to go from 0 to 60. You're not going to blink and be a perfectly simple person. It's a muscle that needs to be practiced.
Hmm.
Anything less, I would say, if you're really good in this area, like if you feel like you've got a handle on simplicity and you're like, oh yeah, I'm living the simple life. Like I've got margin in my possessions. I've got margin in my finances. I've got margin in my time. Like I'm doing a good job on this one. Why don't you drop in the comments, leave a comment and tell us your best tip for how you're able to live simply, how you got there, or how you stay there. Like, let's use this as an opportunity to encourage one another, because we're all different. We all have different learning styles. We all have different abilities. We all have different lifestyles and jobs and all kinds of different needs in our families and lives. And so if you're really good at the spiritual discipline of simplicity and you're like, yeah, I'm benching like 350 right now, let us know how you're doing. Like, what tip would you have for practicing the spiritual discipline of simplicity?
Yeah. Or maybe you don't feel like you're there yet, but maybe you've made some progress in a small piece of this in your life. And you just have like, oh yeah, this is the thing that really helped me make progress on this in my life. You can drop that in there as well.
Yeah. That's awesome. Because we want to celebrate.
Absolutely. Yeah. So go ahead, feel free to give a like, subscribe, share. All of that stuff really helps us to bring this content to people who want it and need to hear it. And so we're thankful for your involvement in our ministry in that way.
See you next week.